The night was unnaturally still, as though the town itself had drawn a cautious breath, holding it in fearful anticipation of what was to come. Fog crept along the uneven ground, thickening around the gravestones that dotted the cemetery like silent sentinels. Each marker, once a proud testament to the lives it memorialized, now leaned at odd angles, half sunken into the damp, dark soil. Moonlight fell in silvery streaks, illuminating cracks and fissures that seemed to move when no one was watching. Residents had whispered of this phenomenon for years, but no one could ever witness it directly. By the time morning arrived, the damage was already done. Tombstones that had stood for decades were buried nearly halfway, their inscriptions obscured, their names swallowed by the earth overnight. For a small town that prided itself on tradition and reverence for the dead, this was an unthinkable violation, a quiet desecration of memory that left families both grieving and bewildered. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A family visiting the graves of ancestors would notice the base of a stone slightly lower than it had been the previous day. They might dismiss it, attributing the change to shifting soil or minor weather events. But soon the occurrences grew bolder. Stones sank deeper, often without any traceable explanation. Some were toppled entirely, their heavy forms lying face down in the mud, as if the ground had conspired against them. Even the most practical-minded townsfolk began to feel unease, a creeping suspicion that something unnatural was at work. There were no signs of human interference, no footprints, no tool marks, no disturbed gravel paths. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Tombstones vanished into the earth overnight, and no one could claim to understand why. The cemetery itself was ancient, dating back to the early 1800s. Its origins were tied to the founding families of the town, whose lineage was steeped in both prosperity and tragedy. Each stone bore a story: births, deaths, unexpected illnesses, and sudden disappearances. The town's history was a tapestry of hope and grief, with the cemetery standing as a silent chronicle of both. Locals had always respected its solemnity, visiting only during daylight, leaving flowers or coins as offerings. Yet now, as if the land itself rejected memory, the cemetery became a place of anxiety. Mothers held their children a little tighter when passing its gates, and elderly residents avoided it entirely, fearing that to look upon the graves was to invite misfortune. Word spread slowly, first from family to family, then through whispered conversations at the market and the post office. Those who had noticed the changes shared their observations cautiously, wary of ridicule. But as more families found their tombstones sunken or displaced, disbelief turned into dread. Some refused to enter the cemetery at all, leaving the work of tending graves to a small, dwindling group of caretakers who worked by necessity and resignation. The caretakers themselves spoke in hushed tones, exchanging glances over tools and freshly turned soil, aware that what was happening could not be explained by wind, rain, or erosion alone. Night after night, they returned to find the same mysterious shifts, each stone slowly succumbing to the earth as if drawn down by an invisible force. Strangers began to notice too. Travelers passing through the town occasionally glimpsed the cemetery's strange visage in the early morning mist. Some took photographs, hoping to capture evidence of what they had heard in rumors. Yet the camera's lens seemed almost unable to grasp the subtle horrors at work. A stone that appeared upright at dusk could be leaning alarmingly by dawn. Inscriptions that were legible in one photograph became blurred and partially submerged in the next. Even those who came with scientific curiosity were left unsettled, questioning whether they had truly captured the anomaly or merely imagined it. Local lore grew around the phenomenon. Some spoke of restless spirits, claiming that the departed sought to reclaim their resting place. Others whispered of a curse tied to the land itself, ancient and unbroken, demanding obedience to rules no living soul could comprehend. Children dared one another to approach the cemetery at night, only to flee in terror when the fog thickened and shadows seemed to writhe among the stones. The town's church offered little comfort, attributing the strange events to divine will or human sin, but this only heightened the air of unease. Faith, science, and reason all collided against the stubborn mystery of the earth swallowing its own monuments. Investigations were informal at first, with residents checking the cemetery daily, marking the positions of stones with chalk or string. Yet even these efforts were rendered futile. By morning, lines were askew, markers were displaced, and any pattern seemed impossible to discern. Each successive night brought new anomalies. Stones that had remained stable for decades now sank abruptly, some tipping at angles that defied gravity. There was no predictability, no logic to guide the observers. The town felt caught in a slow, creeping nightmare, where the familiar became strange, and the sacred became suspect. Amid this growing tension, the cemetery assumed a personality of its own. The ground seemed restless, alive with a quiet, insistent movement. Fog hugged the contours of graves as if shaping them to some secret design. Birds avoided the area, and even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the stones. There was a sense that the cemetery was not merely a plot of land but an entity with intent, choosing when and where to act. Families found themselves negotiating with it, performing small rituals, leaving flowers in odd patterns, and marking stones with protective symbols, all gestures that might have been superstition but offered psychological relief in a town desperate for control over the uncontrollable. By the end of the section, the audience is left with the full weight of the mystery, a cemetery that defies logic, a town paralyzed by fear, and stones that vanish without explanation. The narrative lingers on the emotional consequences, emphasizing grief, anxiety, and the fragile human need for permanence. The story has established a chilling atmosphere, a slow-burning dread, and a question that will drive the entire investigation forward: what force, natural or otherwise, could bury tombstones overnight, erasing the evidence of lives long past? The answer remains elusive, setting the stage for deeper exploration of history, human psychology, and the unresolved terror that haunts this forgotten cemetery. The town that cradled the cemetery was small, nestled in a valley carved by time and weather, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests that seemed almost to guard it from the outside world. Its origins traced back to the early 1800s, when pioneers seeking new land and opportunity had settled along the riverbanks, constructing simple wooden homes and establishing farms that would provide sustenance for generations. The founders were a mix of families escaping urban congestion, war, or political unrest, bringing with them traditions, stories, and superstitions that would linger long after their deaths. The town was isolated in both geography and culture, shielded by winding roads and thick woods, and this isolation shaped its people into a close-knit, if insular, community. Life here followed a rhythm dictated by the seasons, the soil, and the passage of time, yet beneath its calm and orderly surface, a history of hardship and loss simmered quietly, laying the foundation for the eerie events that would later envelop the cemetery. Early records show that the town was both resilient and precarious. Families who built the first homes endured harsh winters, disease outbreaks, and economic uncertainty. Many children died young, leaving behind sorrow and grief etched into the community consciousness. Farms sometimes failed, crops were destroyed by floods or droughts, and families were forced to rebuild repeatedly. Yet the town endured, with each generation adding layers of history and memory. The cemetery was established during this period, intended as a permanent resting place for the dead, a sacred space where the living could honor those who had come before. Its location was chosen carefully, a gently sloping hill at the edge of town, bordered by old oaks and maples, far enough from homes to maintain peace yet close enough to remain accessible. In those early years, the cemetery was meticulously maintained, a symbol of both reverence and permanence, and for decades it stood unremarkable, respected and unthreatened. As the town expanded, small businesses, shops, and communal structures emerged, creating the sense of a thriving community despite its isolation. Generations grew up knowing one another, attending the same schools, visiting the same markets, and sharing the same stories. Oral histories passed down family lines were filled with warnings and advice, tales of misfortune, and accounts of the land's idiosyncrasies. One recurring theme involved the cemetery itself. Locals noted that the earth there seemed different from other parts of the valley, richer and darker, almost alive. Elders would speak of strange animal behavior near the graves or of mist that lingered longer than it should, but these observations were dismissed by the young as fanciful superstition. Still, the seed of unease had been planted, quietly preparing the way for the events that would later haunt the town. Religion and tradition played a pivotal role in shaping the town's identity. A single church served as both spiritual and social center, offering guidance during times of grief and crisis. Clergy preached not only faith but moral order, emphasizing respect for the dead and the sanctity of the cemetery. Annual ceremonies, commemorations, and rituals reinforced the connection between the living and the deceased, strengthening the town's collective memory and cultural continuity. The cemetery was not merely a resting place, it was a canvas on which the town projected its values, fears, and hopes. Families would decorate graves on holidays, place flowers or tokens to honor the departed, and tell stories that linked past and present. It was a living testament to the community's resilience and reverence, yet even within this framework of care, there were hints that the cemetery held secrets the town had not yet begun to understand. The town's geographic isolation contributed to a strong sense of self-reliance, but also fostered myths and folklore that would later intertwine with the mystery of the disappearing tombstones. Locals believed in omens, signs, and natural portents, and they attributed meaning to subtle irregularities in the environment, unexpected fog, unusual animal tracks, shifting winds. Stories of haunted places, restless spirits, and cursed ground circulated quietly, often dismissed by those too busy with daily life to ponder the supernatural. Yet these tales lingered, embedded in collective consciousness, ready to resurface when unusual events demanded explanation. The cemetery, already a sacred and emotionally charged space, became a natural focal point for these narratives once its anomalies began. Historical documents reveal the town endured cycles of prosperity and misfortune. Epidemics swept through at intervals, claiming dozens at a time and leaving families bereft. Fires destroyed homes and businesses, forcing rebuilding from scratch. Land disputes and occasional crime threatened the fragile harmony of the community. All of these struggles contributed to a shared psychological resilience but also left the town sensitive to signs of disruption. The cemetery's role as a repository of memory and loss made it particularly significant. Any disturbance there resonated deeply, striking at both emotion and identity. Families who had lived there for generations felt a profound connection to the stones, the earth, and the rituals surrounding death. When anomalies began to appear, the emotional impact was immediate and intense, magnified by the weight of history pressing upon every resident. The cemetery also reflected the town's social hierarchy and family structures. Prominent families had elaborate plots with carved headstones, symbols of status and lineage, while others had modest markers, simple slabs of stone or wood. These physical markers mirrored the town's values and traditions, making the sudden sinking and disappearance of tombstones more than a practical inconvenience, it was an affront to social order and memory. The erasure of names and dates symbolically undermined the continuity of life itself, creating an anxiety that no one in the town could ignore. The emotional weight was compounded by the fact that some stones belonged to children and infants, whose loss had already been felt in life and now was echoed in death by a cemetery that refused to remain still. By the end of this section, the town is fully established as a character in its own right, with history, geography, and psychology intertwined. The audience understands the significance of the cemetery not just as a location, but as a repository of memory, culture, and grief. Its placement in the valley, its ties to founding families, its connection to tradition and folklore, and its role in daily life all underscore why the overnight disappearance of tombstones is so disturbing. This foundation sets the stage for the creeping mystery, providing a rich, emotionally resonant backdrop for the events to follow. The town is at once quaint and foreboding, rooted in reality yet shadowed by the unseen forces that will test its resilience, beliefs, and understanding of the world. The first murmurs began softly, almost imperceptibly, as though the town itself was hesitant to acknowledge the change. Families who visited the cemetery noticed small shifts in the earth, depressions that hadn't been there the day before. A stone might lean slightly, the base tilting as if the ground had exhaled and shifted beneath it. At first, most dismissed these anomalies as natural occurrences, the work of heavy rains, frost heave, or the subtle movements of the earth over time. But soon, the irregularities became too frequent, too precise, to be easily ignored. Stones that had stood firm for decades now leaned or sank by morning. The pattern was neither predictable nor uniform, defying every expectation and unsettling the town in ways that simple explanations could not reconcile. Residents began to talk in whispers, hesitant to voice their fears too openly. There was a reluctance to confront the possibility that something beyond human understanding was at work. Yet the evidence was impossible to dismiss. A mother visiting her child's grave might find the stone shifted slightly, inscriptions partially hidden in the soil. Families would exchange uneasy glances, questioning one another in private. Had anyone else noticed this? At first, these conversations were cautious and polite, framed in terms of practical concern. But as the shifts continued, the whispering took on an undercurrent of dread, a collective recognition that the cemetery was no longer a safe or predictable space. Fear began to ripple through the town like a slow-moving fog, thickening with every passing night. Early accounts paint a picture of escalating anxiety. One elderly resident recounted how she discovered her husband's gravestone sunken almost to the ground, though she had tended it just days before. Another family found the marker for their young daughter buried halfway, the top portion hidden beneath damp soil. The emotional toll was immediate, grief compounded by confusion, anger, and helplessness. The cemetery, once a place of solace and memory, had become a source of unease, a daily reminder that even in death, control could not be maintained. Children were taught to avoid the grounds after dusk, and families began to schedule their visits only during the briefest daylight hours, seeking reassurance in sunlight while fearing the inevitability of darkness. Alongside the practical consequences, folklore began to resurface and evolve. Stories of restless spirits and hidden curses circulated quietly, whispered among families at kitchens tables or in hushed tones during market visits. Some claimed that the cemetery itself was alive, feeding on memory, punishing those who forgot or dishonored their dead. Others spoke of shadowy figures glimpsed between the trees, moving silently through the fog, or of voices that seemed to echo faintly over the stones, too distant to be clearly heard yet unmistakably human in tone. The boundary between reality and imagination blurred, leaving residents unsure of what they had truly seen and what they had conjured from fear. Yet the repeated, inexplicable sinking of the tombstones gave credence to these stories, lending the whispers weight and urgency. Witnesses emerged in increasing numbers, offering detailed accounts of what they observed. One man claimed to have seen a gravestone move as he slept nearby, a slow, deliberate descent into the earth as though the ground had decided the stone's final resting place. A woman reported returning from town errands to find her husband's marker tipped at an impossible angle, leaning slightly yet seemingly balanced in defiance of gravity. Some residents began keeping rudimentary logs, marking the positions of stones with chalk or string each evening. By dawn, the markers had shifted again, sometimes dramatically. Photographs captured evidence that could not be denied, though even these failed to reveal the mechanism behind the movement. The cemetery's behavior remained shrouded in ambiguity, a puzzle that confounded both local observers and the occasional visiting skeptic. The psychological impact of these events cannot be overstated. Fear became contagious, infecting even those who had not directly witnessed the phenomenon. The mere knowledge that tombstones might disappear overnight created tension within families, communities, and social gatherings. Conversations often turned toward speculation. What force could be powerful enough to displace such heavy stones without human intervention? Could it be a geological anomaly, some unseen erosion of the earth beneath the cemetery? Or was it something far older, rooted in superstition or the unexplained? As the questions multiplied, certainty dwindled, and the town began to fracture under the strain of collective unease. Cultural memory and inherited belief played a subtle yet crucial role in shaping the response. Elders would recount tales of strange occurrences dating back decades, fog that lingered unnaturally, trees that creaked in impossible patterns, animals that avoided certain areas of the cemetery. Though these stories had once been dismissed as fanciful, the ongoing disturbances lent them a weight that demanded consideration. Even the skeptical began to draw connections, noting the repetition of anomalies across generations. The cemetery, already charged with emotion and history, seemed to pulse with a consciousness all its own, as if aware of the observers who dared to measure it, touch it, or question it. Practical efforts to manage the situation were largely futile. Families and caretakers attempted to relevel sunken stones, brace leaning markers, or reinforce foundations with rocks and soil. Each effort failed in turn, the earth reclaiming the markers regardless of human intervention. The cemetery became a site of quiet frustration, where labor was rewarded with temporary stability at best. This physical struggle mirrored the town's psychological struggle, an effort to maintain order against forces both visible and invisible, natural and potentially supernatural. Residents began to view the cemetery with a mixture of reverence and fear, acknowledging its importance while fearing its capriciousness. By the end of this section, the whispers in the graveyard have evolved into a palpable tension that envelopes the town. The cemetery is no longer merely a resting place for the dead, it is a character in its own right, influencing behavior, perception, and emotion. Families live under the shadow of uncertainty, torn between duty to ancestors and fear of the inexplicable. The stage is fully set for the arrival of outside attention, investigation, and escalating phenomena. Viewers are left with a sense of anticipation, the unsettling knowledge that the seemingly sacred ground harbors mysteries that may defy understanding, and that the quiet whispers heard among the stones may carry secrets far darker than anyone yet imagines. As the phenomenon of disappearing and sinking tombstones continued, curiosity slowly overcame fear, compelling some residents to take action. The first investigations were modest, informal attempts to document the shifts and understand their cause. Local families would arrive at dawn, measuring and marking the positions of stones, recording any irregularities in notebooks or on scraps of paper. They employed simple tools, strings to outline plots, chalk to mark bases, and basic rulers to gauge depth. These efforts, though primitive, were born of necessity, a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of order in a situation that defied logic. Early on, the investigators were careful not to draw undue attention, fearing ridicule or accusations of superstition. Yet as anomalies multiplied, it became increasingly difficult to maintain discretion. The initial investigators were largely composed of townspeople with practical skills, carpenters, farmers, and teachers who understood the value of precise observation. They approached the problem methodically, comparing notes night by night, attempting to find a pattern in the chaos. Yet the cemetery resisted categorization. Some stones shifted only slightly, others sank dramatically, and a few disappeared entirely from view, leaving only the soil behind. There were no footprints, no tool marks, and no evidence of tampering by outsiders. Every attempt to establish a predictable pattern failed, and the investigators slowly realized they were facing a phenomenon that seemed to operate outside the realm of known natural or human forces. Word of these efforts spread, drawing a handful of outsiders, curious travelers, amateur historians, and those with a scientific bent, to the town. They arrived with equipment and questions, eager to observe and measure the shifts firsthand. Photographs were taken, measurements were recorded, and sketches of the cemetery's layout were drawn with painstaking care. Yet even these outsiders struggled to reconcile what they saw with rational explanation. Stones moved without warning, some tilting in ways that defied physical expectations, others sinking at odd angles as though drawn downward by some invisible hand. The investigators' notebooks became a mixture of precise measurements and frustrated commentary, each page reflecting the tension between empirical observation and the inexplicable. Despite their best efforts, all conventional explanations fell short. Heavy rains had been cited initially as a potential cause, yet shifts occurred on dry nights, often without wind or other weather-related disturbances. Animal activity was considered, moles, foxes, or larger creatures displacing soil. Yet the scale and precision of the movements far exceeded what any known animal could accomplish, and no tracks were ever found. Ground erosion, soil composition, and even minor earthquakes were considered, but geological studies, though rudimentary at first, revealed no anomalies sufficient to explain the magnitude of the changes. Each failed hypothesis only deepened the town's sense of mystery, confirming that this was not a problem easily solved by practical reasoning or observation. The investigators' emotional experiences mirrored the physical frustration. Caretakers who had spent decades tending graves began to feel helpless, even fearful. Night after night, their work was undone, and a quiet dread settled over those who tried to impose order. Families who had once relied on the cemetery as a place of remembrance began to hesitate before visiting, unsure whether their presence would disturb something unseen or whether they would witness yet another inexplicable change. Fear, curiosity, and grief became entangled, creating a psychological weight that seemed to press on every resident. The cemetery had shifted from a static, predictable part of life to a force in its own right, demanding attention, respect, and caution. As investigations continued, stories from earlier generations resurfaced. Elders recalled minor, seemingly trivial anomalies, stones slightly askew, fog lingering longer than usual, unexplained sounds in the distance. What had once been dismissed as folklore now took on a new urgency. Investigators began cataloging these accounts alongside their own observations, looking for connections, patterns, or historical precedents. Each narrative added another layer to the mystery, highlighting the cemetery as a space where history, memory, and the inexplicable intersected. The town realized that they were not simply dealing with isolated incidents but confronting a phenomenon that had been quietly recurring over decades, perhaps even longer. The methods of early investigation were meticulous despite the limitations of available resources. Night watchers were posted, taking careful note of any movement or unusual activity. Candles and lanterns were used to illuminate the stones, casting shifting shadows that sometimes appeared to move independently of the light source. Investigators noted that the fog thickened unpredictably, obscuring vision and creating a sense of disorientation. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and sounds, distant footsteps, rustling leaves, and the faint creak of stones, amplified the town's sense of unease. Though no conclusive evidence emerged, the psychological impact of these nightly vigils cannot be understated. The investigators were forced to confront not only the mystery of the stones but their own vulnerability in the face of the unknown. Letters, diaries, and newspaper clippings began to accumulate, forming a rudimentary archive of the phenomenon. Observations were detailed, the time of day, weather conditions, placement of stones, and any other seemingly relevant factors. Yet, despite careful documentation, no definitive explanation emerged. The cemetery remained enigmatic, its movements unpredictable, its patterns inscrutable. Frustration and anxiety mounted, but so too did fascination. The town was caught in a liminal space between observation and comprehension, where every night brought the potential for discovery or disaster. By the end of the section, the audience understands the town's first attempts to grapple with the mystery. The cemetery is no longer a silent backdrop, it is a dynamic, unpredictable force. Investigators, both local and visiting, serve as proxies for the audience, embodying curiosity, frustration, and fear. The groundwork is laid for subsequent escalation, scientific inquiry, public debate, and the eventual psychological and social consequences of confronting a phenomenon that resists understanding. The stage is set for tension to build, for rational explanation to collide with folklore, and for the town to experience the emotional and practical consequences of a cemetery that refuses to remain still. The growing disturbance in the cemetery did not go unnoticed by the town's spiritual leaders, yet their response was cautious, tempered by doctrine, tradition, and the social pressures of authority. The local church, a modest building that had served as both sanctuary and communal hub for generations, sought to frame the strange occurrences within familiar paradigms. Clergy members preached that such disturbances were either tests of faith or the result of human moral failings, subtly suggesting that anxiety and speculation might be the true dangers to the living. Sermons urged parishioners to maintain reverence, to pray for patience and understanding, and to avoid indulging in fear. The church's message, though intended to comfort, inadvertently deepened the town's tension, creating a delicate balance between faith and disbelief. Families struggling to reconcile their experiences with spiritual explanations often felt conflicted. Many wanted to trust the guidance of their religious leaders, clinging to the notion that God watched over the cemetery and the departed. Yet when stones continued to sink or vanish overnight, these reassurances faltered. Parents worried not only about the desecration of graves but also about the moral implications of challenging the Church's interpretation. To question the spiritual narrative was to risk social censure, yet to remain silent risked personal anguish as they witnessed the relentless erosion of the markers that honored their loved ones. This tension created an undercurrent of quiet panic, as families navigated the collision of faith, custom, and inexplicable reality. Public meetings offered further insight into the community's struggle with denial and belief. Town elders, clergy, and civic leaders convened to discuss the disturbances, often framing them in terms of natural causes or divine testing. Some insisted that the sinking of tombstones was merely a function of neglect or poor maintenance, urging families to redouble their care rather than speculate about supernatural involvement. Others acknowledged the strangeness of the phenomenon but cautioned against attributing it to forces beyond human understanding. These discussions were tense, revealing divisions within the community, between those seeking rational explanations, those clinging to religious interpretation, and those who quietly suspected something more ominous at play. The influence of religious authority extended beyond interpretation into behavior and ritual. Families were encouraged to maintain proper decorum when visiting graves, to pray for the deceased, and to adhere strictly to established customs. Rituals that had once been expressions of devotion became tools of reassurance in the face of uncertainty. Some families added additional offerings, candles, tokens, or prayers, hoping that spiritual intervention would stabilize the cemetery and restore order to the sunken stones. Yet these gestures, while symbolically potent, had no tangible effect, further complicating the town's collective understanding of what was occurring. The interplay between ritual and reality created a subtle tension. Faith offered comfort, but it could not explain or control the phenomenon. Cultural narratives of curses, restless spirits, and ancestral wrath began to re-emerge, often intertwined with religious interpretation. Elderly residents would recount tales of the cemetery's past, of graves desecrated centuries ago, of land disputes that ended tragically, and of families who experienced misfortune for generations. Clergy often dismissed these stories publicly, framing them as folklore or moral cautionary tales. Privately, however, they sometimes acknowledged the weight these narratives held over the town's psyche. The result was a delicate negotiation between official doctrine and inherited cultural memory, with the cemetery positioned as a site where both collided. As the phenomenon intensified, denial became as pervasive as fear. Families told themselves the shifts were temporary or inconsequential, even as they carefully monitored the stones. Children were shielded from the most unsettling aspects, while elders offered gentle reassurances, insisting that the cemetery's behavior was either natural or guided by divine will. This collective denial served as a coping mechanism, preserving social cohesion and reducing immediate panic. Yet it also delayed meaningful engagement with the mystery, allowing the cemetery's influence to grow unchecked, as the town struggled to confront the reality that the markers of their dead were being systematically reclaimed by the earth. The town's relationship with outsiders further complicated this dynamic. Visitors and amateur investigators who arrived to document the cemetery's anomalies were met with polite skepticism or quiet resistance. Clergy and elders encouraged caution, framing curiosity as potentially disruptive to the spiritual balance of the town. Families were wary of inviting scrutiny, fearing that external interpretations might undermine their faith or provoke ridicule. The cemetery, already a source of tension, became a site of negotiation between internal beliefs and external observation, with religious authority often asserting primacy in defining acceptable explanations. Despite efforts to suppress speculation, the emotional and psychological effects of the cemetery's behavior could not be contained. Residents began reporting restless nights, dreams filled with distorted images of graves, and a pervasive sense of being watched. Anxiety seeped into daily routines, altering behavior in subtle but significant ways. Children were reluctant to pass the cemetery, adults avoided the grounds when possible, and social gatherings sometimes paused at mentions of the phenomenon. The town's denial was no longer merely ideological, it was an active struggle against an unsettling reality that demanded recognition even as it defied explanation. By the end of this section, the audience sees a community caught between two imperatives: the desire to maintain faith and social order, and the inescapable evidence of a mysterious force. Religious and cultural frameworks provide structure, comfort, and continuity, yet they cannot fully contain the cemetery's influence. Denial, both public and private, emerges as a psychological strategy, but it comes at a cost: heightened anxiety, social tension, and a slow realization that the town cannot entirely control or rationalize what is occurring. The stage is now set for the next phase of escalation, where fear, curiosity, and the pressure of unresolved mystery begin to intertwine with the town's social fabric and collective psyche, laying the groundwork for deeper psychological and supernatural inquiry. As the nights passed, the cemetery's disturbances grew more pronounced, transforming the once subtle phenomenon into an undeniable force that gripped the town with fear and fascination. Tombstones no longer merely leaned or sank slightly, some disappeared entirely from view, leaving the ground bare as if the earth had swallowed the markers whole. Others reappeared in impossible positions, tilted at precarious angles, some balanced impossibly on soft soil, others clustered unnaturally, as if the stones themselves were moving with intent. Each morning brought fresh reports from families who arrived to find the graves of loved ones altered in ways that defied logic, amplifying both grief and suspicion. The town's sense of order began to unravel, replaced by a tension that was felt in every home, market, and street corner. Residents' emotional strain became increasingly visible. Caretakers, who had dedicated years to tending the cemetery, experienced a creeping sense of helplessness. Daily labor, once a routine expression of respect, became an exercise in futility, as sunken stones and disturbed plots reversed every effort. Mothers and fathers struggled with the emotional weight of watching markers for children, spouses, and ancestors shift and vanish. Sleep became elusive for many, as thoughts of the cemetery invaded dreams, blurring the line between waking observation and nightmare. Anxiety spread through the town like a subtle contagion, influencing behavior in ways both minor and profound. People avoided the cemetery, and even mentions of its name could provoke hushed conversations and lingering glances, a collective acknowledgement of the unknown force at work. The psychological impact extended to the children of the town. Many were forbidden to approach the cemetery, their natural curiosity tempered by parental fear. Stories of shifting stones, disappearing markers, and strange nocturnal noises became cautionary tales, embedding themselves in the consciousness of the young. Dreams were haunted by images of graves tilting and toppling, and a pervasive sense of dread seeped into daily routines. Even children who had never witnessed the phenomenon directly developed a heightened awareness of mortality and the fragility of the markers that memorialized life. Their play was cautious, and their imaginations populated the spaces between the trees and fog with shadowy forms, blending folklore and reality into a potent, lingering unease. Reports of unusual auditory phenomena began to circulate. Residents described faint creaks, rustling leaves, and the sound of stones scraping against soil in the dead of night. Some claimed to hear whispering voices carried on the wind, unintelligible yet unmistakably human in tone. These accounts added a new layer to the psychological strain, as people wondered whether the cemetery itself was alive, imbued with consciousness or intention. Even skeptical townsfolk could not entirely dismiss these observations, particularly when corroborated by multiple witnesses. The auditory anomalies, combined with the visual shifts, created an environment in which perception and reality were constantly in tension, leaving residents uncertain of what they could trust. Attempts to impose rationality only heightened anxiety. Local authorities and families tried to record the movements, mark stones, and establish nightly vigils, yet the results were inconsistent. Stones sometimes moved in the presence of observers, as though aware of human scrutiny. Equipment such as lanterns, strings, and measuring tools provided only temporary assurance, and by dawn, the cemetery seemed to have returned to its unpredictable state. The inability to control or even predict the shifts reinforced a sense of powerlessness, a psychological strain that affected daily life and social interactions. Conversations often turned to speculation, fear, and moral judgment, with residents interpreting the phenomenon as punishment, test, or portent. The impact on social cohesion became evident. Families argued over explanations, some blaming negligence, others invoking divine will, while still others speculated about malevolent forces or supernatural interference. Disputes arose over responsibility for maintaining graves, and disagreements about ritual, prayer, and visitation practices further strained communal bonds. Even long-standing friendships were tested, as the psychological weight of the cemetery's influence created tension that could not easily be resolved. The town found itself negotiating an invisible but powerful force, one that affected relationships, routines, and collective confidence in the reliability of both natural law and social order. Health and behavior were also affected. Insomnia, agitation, and persistent anxiety became common, particularly among those who had personal stakes in the cemetery. Some residents developed obsessive routines, checking stones multiple times a day, measuring shifts, and cataloging anomalies with growing intensity. These behaviors offered momentary control but also reinforced the psychological grip of the phenomenon, creating cycles of stress and vigilance. The cemetery's unpredictability became a central organizing principle in daily life, shaping schedules, travel, and social interaction. Residents felt caught between the desire to honor tradition and the compulsion to monitor and mitigate the inexplicable. Cultural responses intertwined with psychological strain, as families sought to regain a sense of agency through ritual. Additional prayers, candles, flowers, and protective symbols were employed in attempts to stabilize the cemetery, blending folklore with religious practice. These measures, while emotionally significant, did not influence the physical shifts, highlighting the tension between human belief and uncontrollable reality. The cemetery's movement seemed indifferent to effort, emphasizing the smallness of human intervention in the face of a force that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or easily understood. By the end of this section, the town exists in a state of heightened psychological tension, caught between grief, fear, and awe. The cemetery has moved from being a passive location to an active, almost sentient presence, influencing the minds, emotions, and behaviors of those who live near it. Families are aware that every visit, every measurement, every attempt at intervention may be futile, yet they are compelled to act, driven by love, memory, and the instinct to protect the legacy of the dead. The narrative has escalated beyond physical anomalies into the realm of the psychological, exploring how fear, grief, and uncertainty can shape perception, behavior, and social cohesion. Viewers are left with the sense that the cemetery's power is as much in the minds and hearts of the living as it is in the shifting earth beneath the tombstones. As the cemetery's anomalies continued unabated, the town's growing anxiety attracted attention beyond its borders. Scholars, geologists, historians, and curious amateurs arrived, drawn by the reports of disappearing and shifting tombstones. Unlike the locals, who balanced fear with reverence, these outsiders approached the problem with empirical intent, armed with tools, notebooks, and cameras. They sought patterns, causes, and explanations grounded in reason, confident that careful observation and scientific rigor could shed light on what had baffled generations of townsfolk. Yet from the outset, they found the cemetery defied expectations, challenging assumptions and resisting conventional understanding. Geologists were among the first to offer formal analysis. They examined soil composition, moisture levels, and subsoil stability, seeking evidence of natural causes for the sudden movement of heavy stones. Some hypothesized that underground water shifts or rare soil liquefaction could explain the sinking, while others considered the possibility of minor, unrecorded tremors disturbing the graves. Measurements were taken at dawn, midday, and dusk, and repeated each night to capture potential temporal patterns. Despite these efforts, data remained inconsistent. Some stones sank without any detectable environmental cause, while others remained stable under identical conditions. The discrepancies confounded even the most experienced geologists, suggesting that if a natural explanation existed, it was subtler and stranger than any conventional theory could account for. Historians and archivists joined the inquiry, combing through decades of records, newspapers, and personal diaries. They sought historical parallels, other accounts of anomalous graveyard activity, or patterns that might provide insight into the present. In some archives, they found minor references to graves that had shifted or vanished during storms or floods, though these reports were rare and often dismissed at the time. By comparing these historical anecdotes with the contemporary phenomenon, investigators began to wonder whether the cemetery's behavior was not entirely unprecedented, yet had remained largely unrecognized or underreported. Such investigations highlighted the cemetery as a long-standing locus of mystery, a place where history, culture, and the inexplicable intersected. Even outside experts, however, were not immune to the psychological strain of prolonged observation. Night after night, they documented shifts in the stones, often returning to find their carefully plotted measurements disrupted by unpredictable movements. Some reported moments of disorientation as fog thickened, shadows shifted unnaturally, and the wind carried sounds that could not be definitively explained. Cameras and tripwires sometimes captured anomalies, stones tilting or disappearing in ways that seemed impossible given their size and mass, but these results were met with skepticism and caution. Was the camera malfunctioning, or was the phenomenon truly defying physical laws? Each unanswered question heightened tension and drew attention to the limits of empirical inquiry in the face of a persistent, enigmatic force. The scientific discourse expanded to include potential biological factors. Soil-dwelling animals, subterranean insects, and even burrowing mammals were considered as potential agents of movement. Yet experts noted the scale of the anomalies rendered such explanations inadequate. Large stones moved or sank in ways far beyond what even a coordinated animal effort could achieve. Furthermore, no tracks, holes, or other evidence suggested consistent animal activity. The anomaly remained stubbornly resistant to naturalistic explanations, reinforcing the perception that the cemetery was not merely subject to ordinary environmental processes. Theories also emerged regarding human interference. Vandalism or prank-driven activity was considered, particularly given the unpredictable nature of the shifts. However, investigators could find no footprints, tools, or signs of forced movement. Residents attested to their own observations, noting that stones shifted even under the watch of careful observers. The possibility of a hoax was effectively eliminated, as the pattern of movement was far too complex, subtle, and consistent to be orchestrated by human hands. The cemetery, it seemed, operated according to its own rules, indifferent to human observation or intervention. Folkloric and metaphysical interpretations quietly threaded through scientific discussions. While outwardly maintaining empirical rigor, some investigators privately acknowledged the strangeness of the cemetery's behavior. Could unseen forces, psychological, spiritual, or even geomagnetic, play a role? Was there a historical curse or anomaly embedded in the land itself? Though these speculations were never presented as formal conclusions, they reflected an awareness that empirical investigation had limits. The cemetery, both tangible and symbolic, resisted reduction to conventional logic, reminding observers that some phenomena exist at the intersection of reality, perception, and history. The presence of scientists also altered the town's social landscape. Locals observed the newcomers' meticulous work with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Some families welcomed documentation, believing it might finally offer clarity or protection. Others feared that scrutiny could provoke the cemetery further, inviting disturbance or supernatural reprisal. The juxtaposition of faith, folklore, and science created a tense cultural interplay, as the town navigated competing interpretations of the same events. Observers, too, were influenced by local beliefs, sometimes noting patterns they might otherwise have dismissed, demonstrating the subtle interplay between perception, expectation, and the unknown. By the end of this section, it is clear that the cemetery's mystery extends beyond anecdotal observation into the realm of scientific scrutiny, yet remains stubbornly unresolved. Investigators encounter repeated contradictions, environmental analyses fail to account for movements, historical research reveals parallels without explanation, and physical evidence often defies logic. The town's collective anxiety is amplified by the juxtaposition of scientific authority and inexplicable reality. The stage is set for a deeper psychological and social unraveling, as the cemetery asserts its influence not just through physical anomalies, but through the human response, fear, obsession, and the recognition of forces that cannot be fully understood. As the anomalies in the cemetery persisted, the town's fragile sense of normalcy began to crumble. What had initially been curiosity and cautious observation transformed into an all-consuming preoccupation. Residents found themselves walking on eggshells, checking graves repeatedly, and altering their daily routines around the unpredictable shifts of the tombstones. The cemetery, once a solemn and respected space, now exerted a gravitational pull on the minds and emotions of the living, creating a pervasive atmosphere of tension and unease. Social gatherings became subdued, conversations avoided the subject of the cemetery, and families isolated themselves to cope with the growing psychological strain. The town, collectively, seemed to withdraw inward, each resident silently acknowledging the cemetery's power while attempting to maintain the appearance of routine life. Isolation extended beyond behavior to physical avoidance. The gates of the cemetery, once casually crossed by neighbors and family members, now represented a threshold of fear. Parents forbade children from approaching, warning them of restless spirits or unseen dangers. Adults altered walking routes, errands were delayed to avoid the grounds, and gatherings near the cemetery ceased altogether. Even the caretakers, though committed to their work, approached the grounds with trepidation, often moving in pairs or groups to mitigate the feeling of vulnerability. The physical and psychological separation became a defining feature of life in the town, as if the cemetery itself demanded recognition through absence, compelling the living to observe from a distance while the ground claimed its own authority. The erosion of social cohesion accelerated as families struggled to reconcile their experiences with one another. Disputes arose over responsibilities: who would maintain graves, who would document anomalies, and who would perform protective rituals. Long-standing friendships strained under the weight of fear and differing interpretations. Some residents became obsessive, spending hours monitoring stone movement, while others withdrew entirely, refusing to engage with the cemetery or even speak of it. The town's communal identity, once grounded in shared history and tradition, fractured under the pressure of an unseen force that defied explanation. Each stone that shifted or disappeared was a tangible reminder of human limitations and the cemetery's quiet but inexorable control. Economic and practical life also felt the impact of this isolation. Businesses reported fewer customers as residents limited travel to avoid the roads near the cemetery. Local markets, which had long been hubs of social interaction, became subdued, conversations focusing on practical matters rather than casual exchange. Schools noticed an increase in absenteeism as children were kept home by cautious parents. The cemetery's influence extended beyond the physical space it occupied, seeping into the routines, economy, and social fabric of the town. Its presence was felt not only in shifting stones but in the pervasive atmosphere of uncertainty that altered behavior across generations. The psychological weight of isolation manifested in subtle but profound ways. Sleep disturbances were common, with nightmares populated by tilted stones, collapsing monuments, and fog-filled graveyards. Anxiety became chronic, affecting appetite, concentration, and emotional stability. Residents who had once taken pride in their heritage and stewardship of the cemetery began to feel powerless, their efforts to maintain order repeatedly undone by forces beyond comprehension. Depression and fear, though quietly born, became collective experiences, reinforcing the sense that the town itself was under siege by a phenomenon neither human nor entirely natural. Even those who attempted rational explanation were affected by the isolation. Visiting investigators noted that their observations could never fully capture the scale or irregularity of the phenomenon. Stones moved unpredictably, sometimes under direct observation, defying all known laws of physics. Equipment failed, readings were inconsistent, and photographic evidence often seemed distorted by fog, shadow, or the passage of time. The cemetery's capacity to elude understanding extended its influence beyond the physical space, creating an intellectual and emotional isolation that mirrored the town's social withdrawal. Scientists, historians, and local observers alike experienced the subtle erosion of confidence in their own perception, as if the cemetery not only altered stones but the very lens through which reality was interpreted. Folklore and superstition deepened the sense of isolation. Stories circulated of graves rearranged by unseen hands, of spirits angered by human intrusion, and of ancestral punishment for forgotten rituals. While some families drew comfort from these narratives, others felt trapped by them, recognizing that acknowledgement of the supernatural might both explain and perpetuate the disturbances. The cemetery became a liminal space, existing between rational explanation and cultural memory, a place where isolation was both psychological and symbolic. Residents internalized the mystery, carrying it into their homes, dreams, and social interactions, further eroding the boundaries between the cemetery and the living world. By the time the town fully recognized the scale of the collapse, patterns of avoidance and withdrawal had become entrenched. Families developed private rituals, marking graves and performing prayers in solitude, while public gatherings dwindled and communal oversight waned. Caretakers continued their work, but their labor was often solitary, conducted under the weight of fear and anticipation of further anomalies. The cemetery had effectively imposed its own rules, demanding attention, respect, and caution, while isolating the living from each other, from routine life, and from the sense of continuity once provided by shared history. By the end of this section, the audience perceives the cemetery as an active agent, shaping behavior, social structure, and emotional well-being. The narrative tension escalates, highlighting the psychological and social consequences of prolonged exposure to an inexplicable force. The town's collapse into isolation demonstrates that the influence of the cemetery extends far beyond physical shifts, penetrating human perception, relationships, and communal identity. The stage is set for subsequent attempts to explain, understand, or confront the phenomenon, as the consequences of isolation prepare the town, and the viewer, for the introduction of scientific, folkloric, and historical inquiry in the following sections. When the initial shock of the cemetery's inexplicable phenomena began to subside, what remained was an eerie, persistent quiet that settled over the town like a shroud. The dramatic events of shifting and disappearing tombstones had reshaped the daily lives of residents, and even as active observation decreased, the psychological and emotional residue persisted. Families no longer approached the cemetery with the same curiosity or ritualized care, instead, a collective wariness governed behavior. Visits were hurried and cautious, carried out more out of obligation than reverence. The cemetery, once a sacred and predictable space, had become a locus of uncertainty, its presence an ever-present reminder of human vulnerability in the face of forces beyond comprehension. The immediate aftermath saw the town divided in subtle yet significant ways. Some residents insisted on continuing their traditional practices, maintaining graves, offering prayers, and tending plots with meticulous care. These individuals clung to the routines that had long provided comfort, asserting that devotion and attention could counteract the cemetery's disturbances. Others, however, withdrew entirely, leaving the grounds unattended, erecting temporary markers, or simply avoiding the cemetery altogether. This division reflected deeper psychological coping strategies. One group sought reassurance in action and ritual, the other in avoidance and denial. The result was a town that, while physically unified, became emotionally fragmented, with shared fear and uncertainty creating invisible boundaries between neighbors and families. Communal rituals, once central to the town's identity, declined sharply. Annual ceremonies, commemorative events, and holiday observances that involved the cemetery became sporadic, often sparsely attended or cancelled entirely. Even those who continued to participate did so with an undercurrent of tension, aware that the cemetery's restless ground could undo their efforts overnight. Flowers left for the departed were sometimes found flattened or partially buried, candles extinguished or displaced, small memorials tipped or entirely lost. These repeated, uncontrollable outcomes eroded confidence in the efficacy of human effort, fostering a sense of futility and resignation. The cemetery had effectively reasserted authority over memory and tradition, demonstrating that even the most carefully maintained rituals could be disrupted by forces both subtle and relentless. Social interactions were similarly affected. Conversations, once animated and communal, became restrained and cautious. Residents avoided speaking of the cemetery except in whispers or behind closed doors, fearing that casual mention might provoke further disturbance or invite scrutiny. Gossip and speculation thrived in the absence of transparency, creating a psychological undercurrent that was more corrosive than any physical threat. Even visiting outsiders were treated with caution, their curiosity seen as potentially disruptive to the delicate balance that remained. The cemetery's influence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the grounds, shaping perception, behavior, and the subtle social architecture of the town. The impact on memory and historical consciousness was profound. Families who had long maintained detailed records of ancestors' lives and graves found themselves in a precarious position. Tombstones that had served as anchors of memory now moved unpredictably, sometimes erasing names, dates, and lineage from public view. Oral histories, once reinforced by tangible markers, now faced an unsettling challenge: the physical record was no longer reliable. Some families doubled down on documentation, recording measurements, photographs, and inscriptions meticulously, while others abandoned the effort, accepting that some traces of the past might be permanently lost. The tension between preservation and loss became a central theme of daily life, underscoring the cemetery's role as both a physical and symbolic arbiter of memory. Psychological effects persisted long after direct observation ended. Anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a generalized sense of unease permeated households. Children grew up aware of the cemetery's power, internalizing fear and caution in ways that would shape their perception of the world. Adults reported recurring dreams, phantom sounds, and fleeting shadows, often interpreted as residual influence from the disturbed grounds. The cemetery had become more than a collection of stones and earth; it had transformed into a psychological landscape, imprinting itself on the minds and emotions of those who lived in its proximity. This persistent presence blurred the boundary between memory, perception, and reality, ensuring that even in relative calm, the town remained subtly under siege. Attempts at rational explanation continued but were increasingly fragmented. Scholars and investigators had long departed, their observations documented yet inconclusive. Geologists, historians, and scientists produced reports suggesting environmental, structural, or historical explanations, but none could fully account for the scope, timing, or apparent intention behind the movements of the tombstones. These reports circulated quietly within the town and among academic circles, sparking debate and speculation, but they offered no closure. In the absence of definitive answers, residents were left to reconcile personal experience, cultural narrative, and emerging folklore. The unresolved nature of the phenomenon perpetuated a collective tension, ensuring that the cemetery remained a source of both fascination and dread. Legends and folklore gained renewed prominence in the aftermath. Stories of restless spirits, ancestral displeasure, and ancient curses became interwoven with documented accounts, blurring the line between observation and myth. Oral histories were updated, each retelling shaped by the events witnessed firsthand. The cemetery evolved into a site of narrative accumulation, where human memory, fear, and speculation converged. These stories, while anecdotal, served a functional purpose. They provided a framework for understanding, a symbolic language for articulating the inexpressible. Yet they also reinforced the cemetery's mysterious authority, demonstrating that its influence extended beyond physical displacement into the realm of cultural and emotional impact. Isolation and quiet vigilance persisted. Families who once engaged with the cemetery sporadically now approached with meticulous caution, often performing rituals in private, under the cover of daylight, and with careful observation. Long-established caretakers continued their work, though now largely alone, documenting and monitoring the graves with an intensity born of necessity. The town, though outwardly calm, existed in a state of latent tension, a collective awareness that the cemetery's influence was ongoing and that its mysteries remained unresolved. Silence became both a coping mechanism and a testament to the enduring authority of the disturbed grounds. By the end of this section, the audience comprehends the profound and multifaceted aftermath of the cemetery's disturbances. The town has endured not only physical anomalies but the emotional, social, and cultural repercussions of a space that defies understanding. Families, institutions, and individuals have been transformed, adapting behaviors, rituals, and narratives to cope with persistent uncertainty. The cemetery, while outwardly calm in this phase, continues to exert influence through memory, psychology, and folklore. The stage is set for final reflection and unresolved questions, leaving the audience with a lingering sense of tension, melancholy, and eerie reverence for a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has been irrevocably altered. As years passed and the immediate events of the cemetery receded into memory, the town, and observers from beyond, found themselves grappling with the enduring mysteries that had defied explanation. Scholars, folklorists, and occasional journalists revisited the case repeatedly, seeking insight into the inexplicable movements of the tombstones. Their approaches varied. Some clung to rigorous scientific frameworks, meticulously documenting soil composition, structural integrity, and environmental conditions. Others sought historical precedent, poring over archives for records of similar disturbances in other cemeteries. Despite these efforts, no single theory could account for the full scope of the phenomena, leaving the cemetery as a locus of speculation and awe. The very absence of definitive explanation transformed the story into legend, simultaneously grounding it in reality and elevating it to the status of enduring mystery. Scientific theories dominated the initial attempts at understanding. Geologists repeatedly emphasized the potential for minor shifts in soil composition, groundwater saturation, or frost heave to create slow movement of heavy stones. These explanations, though rational and empirically testable, often fell short when confronted with the scale and precision of the cemetery's disturbances. Stones had shifted overnight, in the absence of rain or wind, sometimes tilting at improbable angles or disappearing entirely from view. Even the most thorough environmental measurements could not predict the patterns observed, suggesting that while natural forces may have contributed, they could not account for the totality of the phenomena. This partial success left room for doubt, fueling both fascination and frustration. Some historians and cultural scholars proposed alternative frameworks, viewing the cemetery as a site where historical memory, human ritual, and psychological projection intersected with physical anomaly. In this interpretation, the stones did not merely move, they symbolically enacted the town's unresolved tensions, generational grief, and cultural anxieties. Families who maintained meticulous records of burials, performing rituals and prayers, found their efforts subverted by forces that defied their understanding. The cemetery, in this perspective, became a mirror reflecting not only the past lives commemorated but the living community's engagement with memory, mortality, and the unknowable. While such interpretations could not produce measurable predictions, they offered insight into the profound psychological and cultural effects of the phenomenon. Folklore and superstition provided additional, equally compelling explanations. Some townspeople continued to recount stories of restless spirits, ancestral curses, or supernatural guardians of the land. Elders suggested that disturbances occurred as a consequence of forgotten rituals, desecrated sites, or breaches in spiritual protocol. Visitors occasionally noted shadowy figures glimpsed between gravestones or sounds that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, an auditory echo of unresolved grief. While these accounts were anecdotal, they contributed to the cemetery's mystique, ensuring that even as scientific observers departed, the narrative of uncanny movement persisted in collective memory. These stories merged with historical and empirical records, creating a hybrid archive where fact, folklore, and speculation coexisted, each reinforcing the other's legitimacy in the absence of closure. Attempts at technological documentation introduced another layer of complexity. Photographs, measurements, and early video recordings captured anomalies that seemed to defy physics. Stones appeared to sink or tilt in the frame, with no discernible agent present. Some images suggested motion between exposures, prompting debates about optical illusions, camera error, or manipulation. Yet even skeptics struggled to account for the consistency and repetition of the events. The cemetery's movements were too precise to be random, yet too unpredictable to be controlled or replicated. Technology provided evidence but offered no answers, reinforcing the notion that this was a phenomenon resistant to categorization, one that existed at the boundaries of empirical understanding. Psychologists and sociologists entered the conversation, considering the human perception of the cemetery as integral to its mystery. Collective attention, anxiety, and expectation may have amplified subtle shifts, creating the impression of movement beyond what was physically measurable. However, multiple independent observers confirmed changes in tombstone positions, suggesting that while psychological factors influenced interpretation, the phenomenon was not purely subjective. The cemetery, it seemed, functioned at multiple levels: physical, psychological, and symbolic, simultaneously affecting reality and perception, memory and emotion. This duality, where stones moved and yet the human experience of that movement became part of the phenomenon, deepened the sense of ambiguity, ensuring that every theory remained partial, incomplete, and provisional. Debate among specialists also focused on possible interactions between human activity and the cemetery's dynamics. Caretakers, families, and observers all interacted with the grounds, performing rituals, adjusting stones, and documenting shifts. Could human presence, even when cautious, have amplified or influenced the anomalies? Some suggested that attempts to control or monitor the cemetery might have inadvertently intensified its movements, a kind of feedback loop between attention and action. Others countered that many of the most dramatic shifts occurred in the absence of human observation, implying that while human activity could influence perception, it was not the primary driver of the phenomenon. This tension between agency and observation remained unresolved, leaving yet another layer of uncertainty. In the absence of conclusive explanation, the cemetery's story evolved into a cautionary narrative about the limits of human understanding. The stones, while immobile in ordinary cemeteries, had here asserted their own rules, operating according to a logic neither fully natural nor fully supernatural. Communities were reminded of the fragility of human memory, the impermanence of effort, and the persistent influence of forces that exceed comprehension. This understanding did not provide closure. Instead, it framed the cemetery as a site of ongoing engagement, a place where observation, reverence, and speculation continued to coexist in tension. Even as physical interventions declined, the cemetery's legacy persisted in both consciousness and culture. Local authorities, historians, and residents alike acknowledged that unresolved questions were perhaps the defining aspect of the cemetery's narrative. Why did the stones move? Was it a natural anomaly, a spiritual phenomenon, or an interaction of multiple forces? Could similar events occur elsewhere, or was this site singular in its properties? Scholars debated the relevance of historical precedent, while families interpreted the events according to personal experience, cultural memory, and moral framework. Each unanswered question reinforced the cemetery's authority, reminding all who engaged with it that mystery itself could be a form of power, shaping perception, behavior, and cultural narrative. The enduring questions extended to broader philosophical considerations. Observers pondered the boundaries between life and death, control and submission, observation and participation. The cemetery, in its silent but persistent assertion of agency, invited reflection on human limitations, mortality, and the complex relationship between memory and space. What does it mean when a community can no longer trust the markers of its past? How do rituals, tradition, and belief interact with forces that elude comprehension? Such questions framed the cemetery not merely as a location but as a symbolic landscape, a repository of uncertainty that invited both reverence and fear. By the end of this section, the audience is left with a sense of unresolved wonder. The cemetery remains active in memory, narrative, and speculation, a site where the ordinary boundaries of reality, perception, and culture intersect. Theories abound, from the empirical to the folkloric, yet none can fully explain the phenomena observed. The audience is encouraged to consider multiple perspectives, understanding that the story's power lies not in resolution but in the tension between knowledge and uncertainty. The cemetery, and the events it has witnessed, remain an enduring testament to the mysteries of history, memory, and human perception, leaving lingering questions that may never be answered. As the years passed, the cemetery settled into a quiet, deceptive stillness, but the events it had set into motion continued to reverberate through the town and its collective memory. Families, scholars, and casual observers alike recognized that what had occurred could not be fully contained, explained, or forgotten. The physical anomalies, tombstones tilting, sinking, or disappearing, had long-term consequences not only for the preservation of history but for the psychology and cultural identity of the community. Even in moments of apparent calm, residents remained acutely aware that the cemetery was not merely a passive landscape but a force capable of challenging human understanding, authority, and emotional equilibrium. Its presence was subtle yet pervasive, a reminder that the boundary between the living and the departed, the rational and the inexplicable, could never be entirely secure. Families who had once attempted meticulous documentation faced the challenge of reconciling memory with reality. In some cases, tombstones were irretrievably lost, inscriptions partially erased, or historical plots distorted beyond recognition. Oral histories became increasingly critical, forming the backbone of communal memory as the physical markers of the past became unreliable. In recounting the events to younger generations, families transmitted both fact and fear, blending observation with narrative, ritual with caution. These stories, retold with reverence and sometimes horror, preserved the essence of the cemetery's disturbances while embedding them within the culture and identity of the town. The legacy, therefore, was not only in the ground but in the collective consciousness of its people. The cemetery also left a complex mark on scholarly and investigative communities. Researchers who had once visited the town compiled reports, photographs, and diagrams, yet these documents offered no definitive explanations. For scientists, the phenomenon represented a challenge to conventional understanding of soil mechanics, environmental dynamics, and the interaction between physical and psychological observation. For historians, the cemetery became a case study in the intersection of human ritual, memory, and unexplained events. Folklorists and cultural anthropologists recognized the narrative value of the story, noting how the blending of empirical documentation with legend created a multi-layered archive of both fact and imagination. Across disciplines, the cemetery's enduring legacy lay not only in what it physically did but in how it challenged the frameworks used to interpret reality itself. Psychologically, the town continued to feel the cemetery's influence. Residents maintained habits of cautious observation and subtle ritual, often checking graves with care, leaving offerings in controlled gestures, and observing silence around its gates. Even those who had long stopped active monitoring reported dreams, fleeting visions, and lingering unease, an emotional imprint left by repeated exposure to the inexplicable. The cemetery had imposed patterns of vigilance and restraint that endured long after the most dramatic anomalies ceased, illustrating the persistent psychological resonance of spaces where order, memory, and mystery collide. In this sense, the legacy was less about stones and soil than about the habits, fears, and emotional frameworks it created within the community. Cultural memory, too, solidified around the cemetery's story. The town developed rituals that were never entirely original but adapted to acknowledge the unusual events that had occurred. Annual commemorations were smaller, quieter, and imbued with a sense of respect tinged by wariness. Even in popular storytelling, the cemetery came to symbolize the limits of human knowledge and the need for humility in the face of forces beyond comprehension. Local artists, writers, and musicians drew inspiration from the strange events, embedding the cemetery's mystery into cultural production that extended its influence beyond the immediate geographic and temporal boundaries of the town. Its presence became a motif, a reminder of fragility, memory, and the uncanny persistence of the unknown. The unresolved nature of the phenomena ensured that speculation remained vibrant. Scholars debated potential causes, unusual soil dynamics, minor seismic activity, shifts in groundwater, or combinations of environmental and psychological factors. Local residents proposed supernatural explanations, ranging from ancestral unrest to spiritual guardianship or curses tied to past injustices. Folklore intertwined with history, offering narratives that were as emotionally resonant as they were unverifiable. This persistent ambiguity became a defining feature of the cemetery's legacy, demonstrating that the power of mystery often lies in its refusal to yield fully to rational explanation. Its enduring appeal was not simply in the stones themselves but in the human desire to understand, control, and narrate what is ultimately unknowable. The cemetery's influence extended to the town's broader identity. Visitors and historians often remarked on the quiet caution with which residents spoke of the grounds, the meticulous yet subdued manner in which families maintained graves, and the persistent, almost reverential stories passed down through generations. The anomaly had become a touchstone of local pride and trepidation, shaping both social norms and cultural narratives. It served as a reminder that even ordinary landscapes could become extraordinary through the interplay of history, observation, and the unexplainable. This duality, both fearsome and fascinating, ensured that the cemetery remained central to the town's collective identity long after the most dramatic movements had ceased. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that the cemetery's legacy is multifaceted. It encompasses physical disruption, cultural memory, psychological influence, and narrative resonance. Its story challenges simple categorization, resisting purely scientific, folkloric, or historical explanations, and leaving its mark in ways both tangible and symbolic. The audience is encouraged to reflect on the power of unresolved phenomena to shape human experience, reminding them that memory, culture, and emotion are as affected by mystery as they are by tangible events. The cemetery becomes a metaphor for uncertainty, mortality, and the enduring tension between knowledge and wonder. Ultimately, the cemetery remains a place of quiet authority, a site where the past and present, the observed and the imagined, coexist in a delicate balance. Its stones, once shifting and vanishing, now rest with uncertain permanence, yet the impact on those who lived through its disturbances endures. The story leaves lingering questions: will the stones move again? Is there a natural explanation waiting to be discovered, or is the cemetery a permanent reminder of human limits? These questions, unanswered yet compelling, form the essence of its legacy. The town, the observers, and the audience alike are left with the unsettling realization that some mysteries do not require resolution to shape understanding, behavior, and memory. In the final reflection, the cemetery is more than a collection of graves, it is a living archive of human experience, perception, and imagination. It demonstrates how spaces, events, and anomalies can intersect to create narratives that are simultaneously empirical, cultural, and psychological. Its enduring presence encourages humility, vigilance, and contemplation, serving as a timeless reminder of the fragility of human certainty in the face of forces that remain just beyond comprehension. The audience is left with a sense of reverence and lingering unease, understanding that the cemetery's true power lies not in what has been seen, but in what continues to be felt, remembered, and speculated upon across generations.